Okay, so I'm going to be taking over right where Rolinda left off. So next slide, please. I have no conflicts of interest. Next slide, please. Thank you. All right, so once you have gathered all of your hemoglobin data, there are a few steps to clean and prepare those data before you can calculate your anemia prevalence in your population. And so we have, the CDC has prepared a standard operating procedure for this process. You can find that document on the Micronutrient Survey Manual and Toolkit website. If you haven't seen this website, I can provide the link after the talk. But it's located here in Module 3, which is for anemia, and it provides a very detailed breakdown of how to clean and prepare those anemia data. I'm not going to go through the full SOP today, but I am going to cover some highlights of the minimal things that you'll need to do before you can calculate prevalence. And just if you go to the Micronutrient Survey Manual Toolkit, you'll see it there in Module 3. I've highlighted where you can find that document, and you'll want to find, it's updated March 2024, and that does reflect the new guidelines from WHO. Okay, so to summarize the key minimal checklist, you'll need to account for elevation, starting at 500 meters and above, as was talked about yesterday. So the table here shows the adjustments for each elevation range in grams per liter. These are the new 2024 guidelines, which do differ notably from the previous guidelines, especially at the higher elevations. And as Lisa said yesterday, you can use the adjustments as given in the table, or you can choose to use the equation and for either of these, make sure that your units align. So if you have collected hemoglobin in grams per deciliter, it is important to make sure that your units are aligning. These are given in grams per liter. So it's one thing to always take note of the units in which you are working. And another note, should you choose to use the hemoglobin equation, the adjustment equation, you should round your adjustment. So if you are using grams per deciliter, you would want to round to 1 decimal point, or no decimal points if you're working in grams per liter. So for example, if you were to come up with an adjustment of 11.455, you would want to round that to 11.5 before subtracting out and adjusting your hemoglobin, because rounding errors can add up as you go along. Next slide, please. Great. So once you've adjusted for elevation, you'll then need to adjust for smoking. So again, the guidelines are shown here in the table, and just as you did for elevation, you'll subtract the amount in the table from your elevation adjusted value. If you have both elevation and smoking data, you'll first do the elevation adjustment, and then you will take that corrected value and take out the smoking adjustment. Note that there are limited data on larger number of cigarettes per day. For example, someone who smokes 50 or 90 cigarettes per day. I know those cases are rare, but should you get a larger number like that, you should still use the 6 grams per liter adjustment as listed here. Next slide, please. All right, so once you've adjusted for both of those, we're going to take an example to show how to do that. Say you have a female living at 1,800 meters who smokes 12 cigarettes per day, and you get a raw hemoglobin value of 18.1 grams per deciliter. Next slide, please. So in my example, I'll be working in grams per liter. So first I would adjust to 181 grams per liter. Again, you can use grams per deciliter. Either is fine, just making sure your units align. Next slide, please. Great. Okay, so then you would do your elevation adjustment. You can see in the table that for an elevation of 1,800 meters, you would have an adjustment of 11 grams per liter. So we'd subtract it out for an elevation adjusted value of 170 grams per liter. Next slide, please. Then we take that elevation adjusted value and we adjust it for smoking. So our example smokes 12 cigarettes per day, so we see that the adjustment would be 5 grams per liter, and we'll subtract that from our already adjusted value of 170 for a final value of 165 grams per liter. Next slide, please. Okay, so once you've adjusted for both elevation and smoking, you can then do some data cleaning within your whole data set. And this primarily involves identifying biologically implausible values, or BIVs. The range provided by the technical brief is less than 40 grams per liter for all populations, and above 180 or 200 grams per liter for women and children. You can see them on the slides here. And any value deemed to be implausible should be examined very carefully and then set to missing for the analysis. So thinking back to our example, our raw hemoglobin value in our woman was 181 grams per liter, and that is above that cutoff. However, after adjustment, she falls down to 165 grams per liter within the plausible range. And so in this instance, that value would not be considered a biologically implausible value and would be retained in the analysis. So really ensuring that you look at your BIVs after finishing your adjustments for elevation and smoking. And for those who are staying tomorrow, there's a tool called the Micronutrient Analyzer tool that we will be going through tomorrow in more detail, and it can do these calculations for you and help you clean your data for you. Next slide, please. Great, so once you've finished cleaning and preparing your data, you can then go on to calculate some key statistics. Next slide, please. And there are several statistics that you can choose to present when describing anemia prevalence. The most obvious is prevalence itself, being sure to include a measure of variation, a 95% confidence interval. This table, this table provides a very detailed example of how you can present both the prevalence, any anemia. You don't need to see the details of the table. It's more the example of how it can be broken down. And you can see you can present not only any anemia, but you can also present the severity categories. So here you see mild anemia and moderate anemia broken down by key demographic characteristics, wealth quintile, age, residence. And within the table, there's also a heat map to show where the greatest burden is within each of those demographic characteristics. So there are ways that you can visualize your data to make it more context-rich and more informative for your readers. So this was an example from the Burkina Faso National Micronutrient Survey in 2020. Next slide, please. All right. You can also report the level of public health significance, which has been defined here and was showed yesterday. So using an example of, say, you have 25% of your population is anemic, that would be considered a moderate public health significance. Next slide, please. For more highly technical nutrition audiences, you can also present some of these driving factors that we have been discussing in this conference. All of the ones present in the models that we've been looking at. You can go into any level of detail here, but really ensuring that you're tailoring it to your audience. It can become very overwhelming very quickly to start spouting off biomarker abbreviations at a very, very technical level to a non-technical audience. So if you're speaking to a very general audience or policymakers who aren't familiar as familiar with nutrition biomarkers, you're going to want to bring it back out, right? So instead of saying, oh, our CRP was high and therefore acute phase response, it's too much, right? So bring it back down and just say inflammation can influence iron status. That's much easier to absorb. And so when you're talking about the etiological factors and you're presenting, make sure you're tailoring it to the right audience there. But you can go into any of the ones we've talked about at any level that we've talked about. Next slide, please. Mean hemoglobin concentration, as Monica was just presenting some, can also provide a bit of depth to your anemia prevalence. And as always, some data visualizations, frequency distributions. I have an example on the next slide. And I believe Dr. Tyler gave a really beautiful distribution this morning by group. So you can really see that the visualizations are much easier to digest in terms of what you're looking at in a curve than a massive table like the one I presented earlier. So finding the best way to present your point can really help get your point across. Next slide, please. Yeah. Oh. So then for report writing, the next few slides have a fairly comprehensive list that we don't need to go through in detail. This is all provided in that technical brief, the best practices technical brief released this year that the two previous presenters have put up. So please, I urge you to go through. It lists all of the ones I'm about to cover fairly quickly. There are key things to present in both your methods and your results. So to move quite quickly through these, in the methods you'll want to include type of survey, and that's important for causality, right? If you're working with cross-sectional data, you can't infer causality. So really making sure to provide that context in the methods so we know how to interpret what you're presenting. Population groups, sampling frames, we need to know how things were weighted and how to interpret. Next slide, please. Information on your analytical devices that we've already talked about, venous versus capillary blood, whether they were fasted, how the blood was taken, are they standing or laying. These are all details that while they could be omitted, when reading your reports, it provides a really necessary context for those who are trying to interpret what they're seeing. So these things, next slide please, can really help enrich your report, and they're so simple to include in your methods that it should just become standard practice. The same goes, Rolinda spoke of training of field staff. All of those things Rolinda spoke about, just describe them in the methods section, and it really helps to enrich your reports. Next slide. The same goes for reporting your results, putting in things like the primary sampling units that you had planned versus what were actually completed, to know what percentage or what number of groups were completed, who refused, who weren't home after the attempts. These can really help provide context of what happened during your survey, not just what was planned, but what actually got done. And that goes for all, so primary sampling units, individuals, the number of measurements, how many were excluded in your statistical analyses, BIVs. Next slide, please. Those can all enrich your sample results. And then same for quality control measures we've touched on a bit. I'll just wrap up with these. It's important to also report these quality control methods, how you tested your devices, what standard reference materials were used, did you calibrate using standardized, the standardized fluids, and the lot number, so that, again, it's all about providing context, which just builds the ability to look at a survey and say, oh, these data I can definitely understand, I could replicate if I were to do a survey similar to it, and I can compare this to a survey that I did because I know the methods were similar. And so it really helps to provide that context. And one last thing, in the module 15 of the Micronutrient Survey Manual and Toolkit, we have also provided a set of hemoglobin data quality table shells that you can use, that you can, go ahead and next slide please, the last one. Again, you don't need to read the details of this slide, but these are examples of data quality shells that we have provided, and you can fill in for your survey that give things like digit preference, skew and kurtosis, details on the BIVs that were excluded and missing data, and those all help provide more information to your reader. And so those are sort of the minimal things that you should try and cover as you first analyze your data and then go to present it and how to really portray to your audiences what was done in the most comprehensive way. And with that, I'll wrap up. Thank you.